गुड मॉर्निंग फ्रेंड्स। मैं हूं आपका दोस्त मदन सिंह, सीनियर एयरफोर्स ऑफिसर, एंड आई एम गोइंग टू टॉक टू यू अबाउट द यूक्रेन वॉर। आई थिंक यूक्रेन वॉर बैकग्राउंड में चली गई है बेसिकली बिकॉज everybody is talking about the Gaza peace accord and what's going to happen to Hamas and Israel. So that's a hot topic. But मैं बता रहा हूँ आपको, the Ukraine war is extremely important because it has the seeds of the Second World War, and that can blossom into the Third World War. So ये बात रखिए, because we must remember that the first two world wars, the epicenter was Europe. The first war lasted from 1914 to 1918, and the second from 39 to 45. And now 80 years have elapsed. There has been no war in Europe, but the Ukraine war could probably convert itself into the Third World War, and there's a possibility, a very, very distinct possibility, unless, of course, Donald Trump can pull a rabbit out of the hat. It doesn't look likely because Trump himself has his clouded vision. उनकी vision बिल्कुल clear नहीं है. He is seeing everything from the American angle. और देखना भी चाहिए. I agree, he must see everything from the American angle. But if he wants to have peace in Ukraine or even in the Gaza Strip, he's got to widen his horizon. You can't, focus on a small point and just continue on that. I think by now Trump must have realized that the main obstacle to peace is Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Now this man has won an election years back, and no election has been held after that, and the net result is that he continues to be in power. He's an unelected president. If tomorrow there is an election, I don't know whether he's going to win or he will lose or what's going to happen. But the fact remains that he is a man now without a mandate. Now that is a thing we must be very clear about. So he is the main obstacle to peace. And the second obstacle, I think this is my personal opinion, is Donald Trump himself. I think Trump wants everything his way. There's an old saying, you want to eat the cake and taste it also, and you want everything yourself. वो चाहते हैं मुझे सब कुछ मिल जाए. Russia should be just written, obliterated, or peace हो जाए so that he can go and get the Nobel Prize. ऐसी things are not the way, things don't work out like that. So gentlemen, Donald Trump is the second obstacle to peace. First is Zelensky, second is Donald Trump, because he is not agreeing to the Russian demands, which are very, very legitimate. मैं आपको बताता हूँ short history of this period before I go on further. 92 में जब Soviet Union broke up into 18 countries with not a little help from the CIA and America, so the Americans were cock-a-hoop with joy. At the same time, the Russians were demoralized, and the Russian president at that time, Boris Yeltsin, made a visit to America, and he put his cards on the table, and he told them, we also would like to be members of NATO. That's the first thing. But at that time, Clinton was the president. He was a very clever man. He said, no, we don't want you to be president, but we'll look after you. So how are you going to look after us? Please tell us. So he said, you tell us. And then Boris Yeltsin spelled out that you will not expand NATO eastwards, number one, because NATO is an essentialist threat to Russia, to the existence of Russia. And our good friend Clinton agreed. But within 6 years, the Americans began to expand NATO eastwards, and small countries like Lithuania, Estonia, and then Poland, and all these countries were made members of NATO in the teeth of the Russian opposition. But at that time, Russia was a very weak country, and Vladimir Putin was not around, so the Americans had their way. They placated the Russians. But then there was a devious plan. I think this is a plan which I am the man who is propounding it. A think tank was made, I think, between the French, the British, and the Americans to break Russia further into another 3-4 countries. And the aim was very simple. The aim was to finish Russia forever for the next 100 or even 500 years as an important player in Europe. Russia would become a non-entity, and the British and the French and the Americans would be cock-a-hoop, and they would be saying jolly good, merry men, everything fine, and they would be ruling the world. So the man who came in next, who succeeded Yeltsin, was Vladimir Putin, and Putin had some very different ideas, and those ideas didn't gel with the Americans. So the next part of the American plan was to incorporate Ukraine as a member of the NATO as well as the EU, and by that they would have ringed Russia completely. Now Russia was not as strong as America is, and Putin did protest, but then Zelensky, in one of his public speeches which I saw on television, held up a piece of paper, like you hold up a red rag to a bull, and he was saying, "This is my application for a fast-track approval to the EU and NATO." This man, Zelensky was so very excited that he wanted to become a member of NATO. He wanted to become a member of the EU within no time, and he thought he is a great knight in shining armor who's going to fight for the Americans and the British and the French and finish Russia once for all. And he had some false notions of history, and he was probably harping on the old days when when Ukraine was a member of the Soviet Union, and Stalin at that time, I think in 1932-33, had induced a famine in Ukraine. That's all part of historical necessity. I won't defend it, I won't condemn it, but harping on to that old age really get no relevance. So, gentlemen, Yeltsin had his axe to grind, and that didn't work out because the Russians invaded. Now here I think Putin committed a blunder. A campaign which shouldn't have lasted more than a week. I think I heard a speech from Donald Trump lately, just 3 days back, and he advised the Russians to have peace in Ukraine, and he was more than amenable to the Russian demands. Secondly, he said a very significant thing: the war should have been over in 1 week, but now it's gone into the 4th year and the Russians haven't won the war. I think Trump is right. And I'm saying the same thing. The war which the Russians launched by attacking first Kyiv and Kharkiv should have been over in a week to 10 days as the maximum, or maybe 2 weeks. You will recollect that when the Indian army fought the battle in East Pakistan and overran over 100,000 Pakistani troops, the whole campaign lasted just 13 days. It was led by General Jagjit Singh Arora and General Jacob, who was a Jew. And they made mincemeat of the Pakistan army. And what a disgrace it was for the Pakistan army, because the losing army, I haven't heard of anybody giving a guard of honor to a victorious general. And General Jagjit Singh Arora received a guard of honor from the Pakistan army when he landed in Dhaka. That's all again part of history analysis, that the Pakis are definitely not good fighters. They're being pumped up, and they've got a bloody nose number of places. The latest one is in Afghanistan. So, gentlemen, as far as Ukraine is concerned, the whole plan of Donald Trump now was that he should stop the war. I agree. Because Joe Biden, I think must be one of the most incompetent presidents anyway. He'd made a visit to Ukraine, if you remember, and he had gone to Kyiv, and he had said, "We will support the Ukraine as long as it gets." Now, what did he mean by this nonsense, you see? But anyway, the war continued, and Biden has been dumped into the Atlantic Ocean. I don't know what he's doing now. He's having a lot of medical problems, wish him best of luck. And Donald Trump came in with its express idea that he would bring about peace. But sum total is, Trump has failed, as I told you, because he himself has become a victim of the American politics. If you wanted to stop the war, the first thing would have been to agree to what I've given you the historical process and ensure that Russia feels secure. And that means Ukraine doesn't become part of NATO, number one. Number two, the Donbas region, which the Russians have now occupied after 3 years of fighting, with just about 20% of Ukrainian territory, and the Crimea may be recognized as Russian territory officially. And then there could be no role of the EU or the EU forces or the NATO forces in NATO forces in Ukraine. They wouldn't have any role. Now, Donald Trump is not clear about it. And secondly, the war could have been over in just 2 days in case the Americans and the other nations of NATO had stopped supplying weapons to Ukraine. And now Donald Trump is hinting that he's going to supply the Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Now here is an escalation. These are very deadly missiles, and Ukraine doesn't have the technical know-how to use these missiles. Let's be very clear about it. They got a range of 2,500 kilometers, and they can strike deep inside Russian territory. I think that is what is the aim is, basically to hit Russia in the core so that Russia says, I give up. Now this again is an misunderstanding of the Russian character, and there again Donald Trump is at fault. He's thinking is by escalating more the conflict, giving weapons to a dictator like Zelensky, Putin will come to the table. दोस्तों ऐसे नहीं होता कभी भी. There are so many things involved, and Trump again has miscalculated Ukraine, like he has miscalculated in Gaza, which I made a separate video and told you what's going to happen. I won't mention it here now. And in Ukraine, I think he completely burnt his fingers, Donald Trump. He should have stopped all weapons to Ukraine. And now if he gives these Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, I think Russians have said it will be a marked escalation. And if any of the Russian centers are hit or Moscow is hit, I think the Russians will mount an attack on NATO. And Vladimir Putin's spokesman has made it very clear that these cannot be launched without help of American technicians and airmen. So if that is going to be the case and the Americans are going to launch these missiles into Russia, I think it's the trigger for World War III. Now this is something which it cannot be trifled with. It is not something, which you say, well, ho gaya, I mean, it will be all over. It's not going to get over. And by holding out this threat of missiles and all which he's going to give to Ukraine, Donald Trump may be thinking he's going to bring the Russians to their knees or something like that. And he's got another fanciful idea that he'll pressurize India and China to stop buying oil from Russia, so that Russia's war coffers are not replenished. It's not simple. Because India is not going to agree with the American dream, and neither is China. That's one part of it. Second part of it, I think Trump knows a bit of history. He must remember that in 1941, when Hitler launched the world's biggest invasion of the Soviet Union over 1,200 miles and 4 corps, replete with infantry, air cover and tanks, they reached up to Moscow, almost 1,200 miles inside Russian territory, and the Russians didn't say give up. So if the enemy, that is the Germans, could reach up to Moscow and still the Russians didn't stop fighting, I don't think Tomahawk missiles and any such thing which Donald Trump is going to give to Ukraine is going to stop the Russian juggernaut from fighting. Russia will fight till it gets its pound of flesh. Now, I wonder how Donald Trump couldn't see through this particular thing, I mean, he should have I think he's a very astute man. But as I told you, he has a colored vision, and that colored vision is that he wants to make America great at the expense of other countries. And he's got a latent desire to finish Russia and China. Now, China, he's a bit scared, I can assure you about it. A little scared of China. Because China not only has a population of 1.4 billion, and the Americans got just about 350 million, manpower is not there on the American side. And another thing which is going against America is that all the powers which are backing America are those which are got old people with them, they're more of old age. Aged people hanging around, whether it's England, France, Japan. Japanese are very badly off, it's an aging population. And a country which is having an aging population, how does it go and fight a war? So China is one thing Donald Trump wouldn't like to antagonize. He didn't want to catch the dragon by the tail. He's astute enough to know. But on Russia, he thinks he's on a safer wicket. And he can continue doing all these things because the Russians at this time practically are regional power, frankly. They have the potential to hit America with nuclear weapons and with their strike bombers, But to have a campaign fighting against America in America is next to impossible. In fact, the Russians will not be able to fight the battle outside the European theater. That's the way I see it. And in any case, the European theater is important, but that could sow the seeds of the Third World War. Now, the First World War started on a small issue. There was the Archduke, if you remember, he was shot dead as the war started. And here also in 1939, Hitler had that conference in Munich. All his demands were conceded by Chamberlain, but then he wanted more and he attacked Poland and the Second World War started. So it started on very small issues but grew into very big issues. And this is what's going to happen in Ukraine. Now the Americans have been giving a lot of sophisticated weaponry to Ukraine. But one thing the Americans are forgetting, and that is Ukraine doesn't have the manpower to fight now. You may give them HIMARS, you may give them Tomahawks, you can give them anything, but you need the men. And if the men are not available, then already there is an indication that Britain and France and some of these misguided countries who are no longer world powers, they're no longer world powers. They have created a word, alliance of the willing. What is this alliance of the willing? It's a big joke. So they want to, it's a cover up to send their own troops to fight in Ukraine. And I think the British Prime Minister has really forgotten what happened in 1961 when Nikita Khrushchev, who was the first secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, made that fantastic statement in which he had said, I need just 5 to 6 H-bombs, thermonuclear bombs, and England will cease to exist on the world map. At that time, I remember, I think I read later that Harold Macmillan, who was the British Prime Minister, really perturbed. And Kennedy then assured him, oh, don't worry, we'll do something for you. Well, it's something like that. England and France, if they start a world war now by putting the alliance of the willing and all that crap, they're going to be writing their doom. I think we'll be reading in the history books the end of the French and the British civilization, and I think they're wise enough, they won't do it. And same thing with Donald Trump. Now fighting or getting a peace in the Gaza against an enemy like the Hamas, which is not a global force, which doesn't have a standing army, is a different kettle of fish. They're just a terrorist organization. While here you are facing a very organized force which has a very professional army. Yes, they have bungled up the Ukrainian campaign very badly. There's no doubt about that. A campaign which shouldn't have lasted more than 2 weeks has now gone into the 4th year. And partly it is because the Americans have fueled it. They've been pouring fuel into the fire and supporting Zelensky. When Donald Trump came, he realized that Zelensky was an impediment and he really gave him a dressing down in the White House. But that's all over. And now I find he's moving around and treating him as a big pal, So again, as I tell you, the issue is Donald Trump has not got that spark of greatness if he wants to have peace. He's playing a brinkmanship game, thinking that Russia will not use nuclear weapons and World War III will not take place and war will remain on a threshold below a nuclear war, and finally what will happen is the Russians will throw in the towel and say, okay, we give up, and there'll be peace. That's a very a fictitious dream, something like you keep dreaming and what's there, like the 72 Hoor everywhere. So this is something which Donald Trump should have been wise enough to know. So now what is next going to happen, gentlemen? The situation is at a very precarious point. I'm afraid the Russian army, I expected a better show from them. They haven't been able to win the war. And it's a stalemate. And if you ask me if there has to be a solution now, the solution should be only one, that is, Russia keeps the territory which they have occupied, number one, have an election in those areas which the Russians are still claiming, have a plebiscite, Russia or Ukraine. Secondly, Ukraine doesn't become a member of the EU or of the NATO for the next 100 years, have elections in NATO, remove Zelensky as the dictator, and at the same time rein in the British Prime Minister and the French President. They got to be reined in because they are broncos trying to ride and become big powerful nations, which they are not. They lost their empires and they are fifth-rate powers now, and without America they are nothing. And the only thing what they can do is to go to Washington, sit at the feet of Donald Trump and sort of beg him, sir, do something for us, do something for us. And Trump, is a narcissist. He likes to hear people talking about his greatness, and he hasn't thrown in the towel in Ukraine. He should have done that, given the battle up. And at the same time, I think they should dismantle NATO. NATO is an obsolete organization. If you want world peace, then NATO shouldn't exist. Because NATO is like the red rag to a bull. And a bull which is not at all powerful, he's just, and NATO will be moving around here and there, and they haven't fought a single war. And if they put their boots on the ground in Ukraine, they'll get to know what battle is. France, as it is, facing an insurrection of the people there. They want Macron out. And the British Prime Minister, of course, humiliated n number of times by Donald Trump, still continues saying, yes, sir, three bags full. Well, gentlemen, I hope it's a thing which is you are getting my point of view. World War III could come from Ukraine, and that'll be a very sad thing, of course, if it happens. And it would be the fault of the American President Donald Trump. It's fair and square. If he wants, he could have stopped the war anytime. Even now he can stop it. And now coming down to the next thing, I hope, gentlemen, you subscribe to my channel, share it with your friends. I look forward to great interaction with you. Now, what I think is this is a bit of a longish video, mostly because I've been talking a lot. But I hope you got my line of thought, And as a historian who's written a fair amount of books on various subjects, including 7 novels, I find that time has come that somebody must pull the chestnuts out of the fire. Who's going to do it? Donald Trump? Let's hope so. Goodbye and God bless.